I'm going to go through the Derek Mahon MindMap now, okay? So for those of you who are maybe new or aren't in my class in school, whether it's in Brunner or in the Institute of Education as day school students, or indeed in my grind classes, I've put together this book of mind maps, which I think will be, well, I know are very useful for revision. And I'm going to go through them now, go through the Derek Mahon mind map now really quickly, and just make sure it's all clear and fully explained. Don't forget, I've said it before and said it in every video, if you're looking for copies of these notes, PMCBrunner at iCloud is how you contact me, okay? Now, so let's get going. So the one we're looking at is Derek Mahon. So there's loads of paper one mind maps. I'll make videos on them as the year goes on. Great for revision. I have loads on Macbeth. There's Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, Banquo, Macduff, and there's one on each one of the poets, okay? So very, very useful for anybody doing their revision. I also have a document, by the way, on every single one of the comparative notes other than the novel Dolores. So if you are looking for that stuff, you will be able to access them. Now, sorry, I'm not going too far down there now. So what we're doing now, we're going to talk about this poet, Derek Mahon. Now, Mahon is an important poet for your revision this year, okay? And the reason he is because he is Irish, and he's contemporary Irish. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he's very much a poet from modern Ireland. And there are two contemporary Irish poets on the paper this year. That's Derek Mahon and Paula Meehan. And I'll be looking at Paula Meehan next month, both in class and in the video content. And I firmly believe that at least one of those two poets will be on your paper this year. Now, I might be wrong, which is why I would never just cover two poets, but I think it's extremely likely. Mahon, so I'm going to go through this quickly, and I hope you find it useful. Mahon is a poet who is always thinking, and whose work is thought-provoking. And I think a great quote to learn, even if you're not studying this poem, and I don't teach this poem to students because it's very challenging, it's very long, and I don't find it, I have this fear that students write too much about it, but I'm not saying don't do it. It's a great poem, This Yew Shed in County Wexford. But there's a great line in This Yew Shed in County Wexford which kind of sums up Mahon's poetry for me. And that's, even now there are places where a thought might grow. It's a brilliant line. And that kind of sums him up. His work is so thoughtful. And he goes and he finds, things that, ideas and inspiration in really unusual places. So, the Titanic and the story of Bruce Ismay. This guy who's gone down as a pariah, as somebody who's, a coward and represents the worst of humanity. But Mahon finds inspiration in him and finds humanity in him. In the story of Lawrence Oates in Antarctica, in the story of Swar Le Bouy in Rathlin, in his own personal experience of being an outsider in Ecclesiastes, of this fanatic, this composite character that he makes up in As It Should Be, this killer. And then, of course, the beautiful, Jesus, I love it so much, the Chinese restaurant in Port Rush, and you have the proprietor of the restaurant who's an outsider and an emigrant, but who sees beauty in the world despite the fact he misses home. So his poems are, he finds a thought everywhere he looks, often from history, from his own experience, from the world around him. So even now there are places where a thought might grow. Is a great quote that sums him up. I cover 6 poems when I'm teaching Mahon. Those are the 6 I cover. Your teacher is free to cover any poems by Mahon that are prescribed in the course, probably doing a couple of ones that are different from mine. What do we know about him? He's a narrative poet. All of his poems are built around stories, and he explores his themes through storytelling. As I said, his poems are often character-based. Of those 6 poems there, actually all 6 of those poems are character-based, okay? Bruce Ismay, Lawrence Oates, and The Fanatic and As It Should Be are 3 of the most notable characters, and his work is also really filled with very vivid setting description. So obviously the Titanic, the Antarctic, the rural landscape of the Hunt and As It Should Be, Rathlin Island as a sanctuary, modern sanctuary, and the site of a massacre in that poem, and Port Rush in the off-season. Brilliant. It just makes me smile thinking about that poem, in the Chinese restaurant in Port Rush. In his poems, he creates these kind of very specific scenarios. So a guy sitting on a boat looking at and hearing the Titanic as it breaks apart and sinks. A guy walking out to die in the howling snow of Antarctica on the Terra Nova expedition. a guy boasting about hunting down somebody he calls a mad bastard and killing him in this kind of car park between 10 sleeping lorries and an electricity generator. He creates these a man standing on the coast, hearing his loved ones being murdered and their screams being carried across the water to him by the wind. Very, very specific scenarios in his poems, and it makes the poems really, it gives them a real grounding in the real world and makes them very engaging. And the reason he carves out those stories, he doesn't tell those stories for the sake of it. He tells those stories because he wants to use the stories to explore his themes. And his themes are rarely very personal, and they're always relatable, which makes them universal. He thinks about things like personal failure, regrets, the human capacity for heroism, our weakness, our capacity for violence, and the roots of bigotry and discrimination. And one of the things that he does in his poems, he works really hard to do, is to offer a different or unique perspective on familiar subjects and events. For example, the sinking of the Titanic. And therefore his work is worth reading because it's challenging. It challenges us to look at the world, to open both eyes, to reference the poem Ecclesiastes, where he talks about the idea of the one-eyed man being king. At the core of his poems, and I would suggest getting your study going now, are the key metaphors and symbols in his poems. These are great. There's one from each of the poems here. I'd highly recommend you learn each one of these quotes, okay? And if you learned one quote, one kind of symbol quote from each poem, you've got really good preparation, because you're going to be asked, if he comes up, you're going to be asked about language, and you can write about his use of symbolism. The tide leaves broken toys and hat boxes silently at my door, capturing in just this brilliant metaphor the impact of trauma and how long lasting it is, and how we're haunted by traumatic events. In Rathlin, a lone light that repeats one simple statement to the turbulent sea, a brilliant metaphor for history being a warning against the storms of the present day and conflict and our potential to repeat the mistakes of the past. In Ecclesiastes, one of my favourite lines, bury that red bandana and stick that banjo. The bandana, the stick, the banjo, representative of his identity as an artist, representative of him being, somehow an itinerant, wandering entertainer. That's the artist, the free spirit. And in order to become accepted by his people, you have to bury a part of who he is. Brilliant metaphor for identity. The solitary enzyme image from Antarctica, just capturing how powerless Lawrence Oates was, but just what a fantastic symbol to represent, our individuality, but also the fact that we all belong to the bigger organism, which is humankind, and we should be less quick to condemn each other when we consider that. The Yellow River, the moon in the Yellow River, and as it should be, one of those images that really frustrates students and gets them over analysing. Just remember, it basically is the speaker saying, I don't want any moral or ethical questioning of what I did. The moon in the Yellow River is a reference to philosophy, and philosophy is all about thinking what's right and what's wrong, and how we behave. This fella says, I know as it should be, therefore I don't want to hear any, the crucial term being idle talk. Okay, he thinks that talking about morality and whether or not killing is right or wrong, or whether he's right or wrong, is a waste of time, and it gives an insight into his ignorance and his single-mindedness and his fanaticism. And then, of course, in the Chinese restaurant in Port Rush, that amazing image of the ship, the sail, as the man looks out across the sea, and he says the sail is an ideogram on a sea cloud. That just vivid image which connects the man's existence in Ireland with his roots in China, and brings the whole poem together in terms of what it's talking about, identity and the emigrant experience, and that possibility of finding a new life while not forgetting the old life, all in that brilliant symbol. Very important. The similes, he's a master of simile. 3 great similes here. Now, the middle one is too long to learn. I wouldn't learn really long quotes, but I love it, its integrity. So this lovely one, the proprietor of the Chinese restaurant stands in the door as if the world were young. Like, you've just learned it from there. It's a great quote. It's a great quote. Ages of this in Rathlin, till the report of an outboard motor at the pier fractures the dream time, and we land as if we were the first visitors here. Again, great simile. Like that, he says that's how it feels. It feels as if, you know, we're the first people ever to come out to this island, because that's how perfect and serene and unspoiled it seems to be. But that's not true. People have been out here before. People still live out and visit Rathlin Island all the time, of course. But he says that's how it felt when he arrived there. And then this amazing ending to after the Titanic. My poor soul screams. The image of a soul screaming, like it's capturing the obviously, my self-pity, my poor, like, you know, of Bruce Ismay. But he's in pain. He's in great pain. And this image of his heart breaks loose and rolls down like a stone. And, you know, one thing's for damn sure, even if you find that difficult to interpret, the image of the heart as a stone. The heart is the beating centre of who we are. It's an easily recognisable symbol for love and humanity. And the heart turning to a stone is an easily recognisable symbol of suffering and of the kind of trauma that is described in the poem After the Titanic. And, you know, like so many images, don't overanalyze it. It's just a brilliant simile, and it's striking, and it tells us something about the suffering of the speaker in that poem. And it's beautifully created by Derek Mahon. And then, you know, what else do we consider about his poetry? Well, his ability to create, like, really bring setting to life. The aural sense is always stimulated in a Mahon poem. His use of onomatopoeia, you know, and all those examples there, fantastic. His use of sibilance, so effective. The repetition of that S sound, you know, the springs softening the sharp air of the coast. The air blows softer since his departure. The numb self-sacrifice of the weakest. Sibilance is a feature of his poetry, and if you want to say, you know, what effect it has, well, it creates atmosphere. It brings this kind of sense of the mood of the scene to life. But also, like any kind of rhythmic technique, like alliteration or consonance or assonance, it helps focus your mind onto the line. It sharpens the image. And then you get one like number 5 there. As I sat shivering on the dark water, I turned to ice. Like he's provoking not just your aural sense there, but like your haptic sense, your tactile sense. You can feel, you know, when he says sat shivering, you can feel the experience of the man sitting on the lifeboat watching that ship and his life as he knew it go down. His openings, he's a storyteller. Storytellers need to have great openings. His openings are brilliant. You know, a long time since the last scream cut short, you know, they said I got away in a boat and humbled me at the inquiry. I am just going outside and maybe some time. We hunted the mad bastard. You know, these are brilliant, brilliant, brilliant opening lines, and they're not brilliant by accident. They're brilliant by craft. Derek Mahon was a craftsman, a beautiful, talented Irish writer, and I love him for it. And I'm grateful to him for his writing. All these writers, this brings joy into my life. So look, great opening lines is a feature of his work that makes it engaging. He uses contrast and juxtaposition repeatedly in his poetry. He startles the reader with unexpected contrast, and he does that in all 4 of those poems, After the Titanic, Rathlin, Antarctica, and As It Should Be. And if you watch the little videos I've done on a couple of those poems, you'll see that. But like that idea of in Rathlin, the contrast between the peaceful island now and the horror of the island at the time of the massacre described. That's a really striking contrast. The contrast between the peaceful island now and the bombs dozing in the housing estates, it grabs your attention, brings you in. You know the contrast in After the Titanic between the drama of the sinking of the ship, prams, pianos, pandemonium, you know, all that, the boilers bursting, with then what comes in the majority of the rest of the poem, which is this really kind of long drawn out, quiet, miserable existence where, you know, Bruce Ismay takes his cocaine and will see no one. And sometimes one of the things that he does brilliantly in his poetry is he uses words of one syllable to create very direct, clear images and to communicate very direct, clear messages. As I said, a long time since the last scream cut short. Beautiful, 9 syllables, and the meter is so, you know, powerful and grabs our attention. The line gets into your head. God, you could love it. God help you. The simplicity of the language, mirroring the simplicity of the philosophy, that he says you could love if you were to give yourself over to it. This idea of being one of God's chosen and not having to, feel called upon to understand and forgive in Ecclesiastes. And then, of course, the single-minded certainty, frightening certainty of the fanatic in as it should be. This is as it should be. There's a violence in those words, that there's an intolerance in those words, there's an aggression in those words that is not accidental. They come about because of this guy's fantastic ability as a writer. Finally then, this is a guy who writes in the Villanelle form in Antarctica, who can carve perfect meter in his poems, giving his poems a lovely beat, uses rhyming and alliteration, creates a cacophony in After the Titanic, uses repetition, in all of his poems to great effect. And I just noticed there's a mistake in that map there. Sorry, now I'll fix that. Pays attention to those little details. Those little details, we've talked about them before in class, that make all writing authentic. We talked about personal essays, writing speeches. A writer who pays attention to detail gives their writing a concrete truth, reality that is very important. And when you read a Mahon poem and you hear the list of the different birds on Rathlin Island, or you get the description of the shipyard silence and the tied up swings in Ecclesiastes, or you hear the list of noises in the Titanic that I referred to a moment ago, or you hear that the fanatic hunted that mad bastard through bog and moorland into the starlit west and gunned him down in a blind alley among 10 sleeping lorries and an electricity generator. This, he's a brilliant writer. The line in Antarctica, goading his ghost into the howling snow. Goading his ghost into the howling snow. It's perfect iambic pentameter. The G, goading, and ghost is alliteration, making the line, pop off the page. Howling is onomatopoeic, bringing the atmosphere together. It's one, and the verb choice, goading, is a typical example of his attention to detail, because you get the sense of what a struggle it was for Lawrence Oates, Mahon imagines, to walk, even because he had terrible frostbite and he was in agony. So there's one line which sums up this, and that poem is a villanelle. This Mahon was a brilliant writer, and if he comes up in your leaving cert, look, where I stand, I think this stuff is of value. Forget the leaving cert; it's of value to read this stuff for anybody, especially young people in the world that we live in today. But for your leaving cert, this is a great poet. He's interesting. If they ask you on him, they're going to ask you to talk about the themes he discusses. I've mentioned them already. How we judge other people. How we judge people when they fail. How we live to regret the mistakes that we make. How we are capable of being heroic in even in the worst kind of situations. Our weaknesses as human beings, our tendency towards violence, bigotry and discrimination. I didn't even put in, I'm actually going to put in identity in there as well, because identity is a big theme for Mahon as well. There's so many themes that are relatable. You talk about those across his poems, and they're going to ask you about whether or not he has a distinctive style, or whether you find a way he writes memorable, or whatever way they phrase it. The questions aren't that complicated. Well, sometimes there can be, but just don't do those difficult questions. And you'll find yourself in good order. So I hope you found that in some way useful. I'd love you to do that if you're watching these videos and you're finding them useful. If you're not in my classes and you're not getting the mind maps and you'd like to get copies of them, you can get a set of notes with a 70-page act and scene summary of Macbeth, a 10 essay pack on Macbeth, a detailed 2,000 to 3,000 word note on each one of your comparative texts, and this 25-page mind map. All that material for 25 quid. And if you want it, PMCBrunner at iCloud. Have a brilliant week.